When we think of progressive leaders throughout entertainment and history, many of the greats we tend to remember are those who within the general public have a very strong standing. We revere these people as the best of humanity, those who push us forward into new eras and ideas. These are the people who shape our world into a more welcoming and accepting one. In the case of John Callahan, however, this is the complete opposite. John Callahan is one of the strangest, most controversial minds that could be put into the class of a progressive artist. On one hand, he was a quadriplegic cartoonist, pushing the boundaries of who could exist within spaces of entertainment and charming the masses. On the other hand, much of his work was racist, sexist, homophobic, or some combination of those ideas. His art was made to offend and shock, no matter who it was. From comics to television to even music, Callahan left an impact on the world, whether it be good or bad. Today I'd like to dissect him, his work, and where it stands in the context of 2022. So join me as we look at the man who couldn't get very far on foot.
I see the trails of bloody nails.
On February 5th, 1951, John Callahan was born in the city of Portland, Oregon. He was soon put up for adoption by his mother, and eventually found a home with Rosemary and David Callahan 6 months after his birth. While originally adopted because the Callahans believed they themselves could not conceive, John would eventually become one of 8 children in the Callahan household. As time went on, John felt more and more that he was an outcast, which might be in part to being an orphan within a large family. At the age of 12, he was properly introduced to alcohol after he drank an obscene amount of gin at his own grandmother's wake. To him, not even the intense vomiting afterwards could make him hate it any less. In his short film, I Think I Was an Alcoholic, he talks about how drinking made him feel more normal. Everything was difficult without alcohol, but with it, he felt confident enough to do all the things he couldn't do sober. Alcohol abuse continued throughout his teenage years, only growing worse and with a far greater expansion of substances to misuse. At the age of 21, after a late night of drinking, John was out with one of his friends who had also been partying with him. As John claims, he was less drunk than me, as the friend was driving the car back home. On their way, the friend crashed the car into a pole, barely harming himself but sending John flying out the window. He was officially a quadriplegic. John was now paralyzed from the neck down, just barely being able to use his arms and hands. Many of his fingers were stiff and could barely move, and his life was now in shambles. Stuck in a nursing home for 3 years, his alcoholic tendencies only got worse. He drank heavily, still drinking with friends and even his care. He was eventually kicked out and continued to drink his life away.
One day, home, alone and half drunk, I happened to drop my bottle. Try as I might, I simply couldn't reach the bottle. I became so upset, I began to break down. I started screaming and didn't care who heard. I was so frustrated I began screaming at God, who I didn't even believe in. As I raved, I felt the anguish of my entire life. I cried a deep and cleansing cry like a child. At the same time, I felt strangely comforted. I rolled to the telephone and called for help. From that time till now, I have not wanted a drink.
This moment of tragedy was what Callahan needed to live again. He found new ways to go about expressing his feelings and channeling his emotions. Art became a primary focus, using both of his hands to grip a pen and draw. After doing some research on other quadriplegic cases, I found that using alternate ways to write wasn't uncommon at all. Dawn Stark, a woman who became paralyzed in 1989 after a slow but sure case of spinal meningitis, learned to write with her own mouth after much practice and coordination. One of the most fascinating parts of her case was that even after learning to write with a different part of her body, many of the intricacies and tells of her handwriting were still present. It's curious to think if this same principle applied to Callahan himself, as he was at least able to somewhat use his hands when writing. After picking up this new passion of his, John Callahan would not only create a way to communicate through art, but start a career path that he would call his own. Starting off small, John Callahan found a home for his comics in the Willamette Week, an alternative tabloid-esque newspaper operating in Portland, Oregon. Over 200 other newspapers printed his comics as well, and over time the amount of complaints about his work piled higher and higher. He was known for being controversial, and sometimes the hate was more deserved than other times. His body of work was made to fire in every direction, taking shots no matter who it was. While crude in style, John Callahan's work could sometimes be extremely poignant and thoughtful. Take this strip, for example. Two people that are no more than heads on wheels sit next to each other begging for change. One wears an eye patch, and the other says, "People like you are a real inspiration to me." Callahan explains this strip in Touch Me Someplace I Can Feel, commenting on how annoyed he is of able-bodied individuals who say similar phrases to him. He feels confused at how his struggle is somehow inspiring to those who don't deal with the same issues. In a lot of ways, he feels frustrated by pity and infantilization of him as a person. While something like this is incredibly intelligent, a lot of his work doesn't hold the same witty or sharp value as comics like these. One strip that sticks out like a sore thumb is as follows. A scene which depicts an assumedly Asian couple sitting at their couch with their pet dog. The husband says to the wife, "Let's walk the dog," making a crude pun at the term walk versus walk, as well as the racist stereotype of Asian cultures consuming animals like cats or dogs. There is nothing transformative, no greater message, and no sense of intelligent commentary being displayed. It is racist and disrespectful, especially to a set of cultures that within America have experienced and continue to experience racism, violence, and discrimination. Many of John Callahan's cartoons were rightfully reprimanded, with many people writing letters to those who published his work complaining about the offensive content he produced. He continued on despite this, becoming infamous for his crass and shocking style of cartooning. Over time, he received awards for some of his works, and became quite popular with those who viewed his comics. Gary Larson, creator of The Far Side, apparently loved his strips, and even the great Robin Williams had a lot of respect for him. Williams eventually ended up buying the rights to a movie about Callahan's life, which wouldn't see the light of day until after his passing. The 2018 film Don't Worry, He Won't Get Far on Foot stars Joaquin Phoenix, and chronicles John Callahan's struggle with addiction and getting used to his new life as a quadriplegic. While generally well received, I personally think this movie focuses on the wrong parts of Callahan's life. Considering his own philosophies and gripes with how disabled people are treated, having a movie that focuses more on him as an alcoholic quadriplegic, and not as much on him as an artist seems a bit counterproductive. Pelswick is one of the two animated series that John Callahan helped to create in the early 2000s. Following the titular character, the show focuses on the day-to-day quirks of being young. The show has the unique perspective of Pelswick himself being in a wheelchair, and the show never backs down from commenting on problems that disabled people face. The character of Pelswick is very well done, as his disability is never the entire purpose of who he is. He's a regular kid who just happens to be in a wheelchair, trying to make his way through middle school. Quads was the second cartoon that John Callahan created, being the complete opposite of Pelswick. The show is crass, adult, and offensive, much like the early comic strips of Callahan's career. The show follows main character Riley, a drunk who gets run over by a car, leaving him as a quadriplegic in a wheelchair. After his accident, Riley receives a mansion from the rich driver who hit him, and gets into all sorts of insane situations with his other disabled friends. All of this chaos goes on while the gang is as rude and off the wall as they want to be. Riley seems almost autobiographical to Callahan, having a lot of the same nuances and backgrounds to the creator himself. It's interesting to compare these two shows, as they both seem to be different sides of John Callahan as a creator, while also being both very similar in core identity. One of the most interesting and notable works of John Callahan's career was Purple Winos in the Rain, a blues album of entirely original music. John himself wrote all the songs, performed ukulele, and sang as well. The album was produced by the notable Terry Robb, known for his session work with a myriad of blues artists. The lyrics are dark and poignant, and it gives a much more intimate side to John Callahan as a person. While simple, many of the songs are carried by a depth and emotion that you don't see in a lot of his other work. Purple Winos seems to pull back the curtain of irony and harshness to reveal a person who has been hurt by the world around him. So why are we talking about John Callahan? What purpose does it serve to talk about a quadriplegic who made edgy cartoons? Well, I think it's important to discuss John Callahan and his place in a world that increasingly favors representation. As time has gone on, we have started to see more representation in media that is diverse, accurate, and created by people who exist in those groups. When it comes to this idea, where does John Callahan sit? Surely his cartoons are some of the largest representation for quadriplegics and similarly disabled persons in media. When you think of characters in wheelchairs, which ones come to mind that don't either paint them as a saint or universally loved person, or who center most of their characterization around being disabled? The work of John Callahan was built on the philosophy of being just as likely to be wonderful or horrible as anyone else, and that is extremely important. But how much of his work is worthy of this praise when so much relies on attacking other groups? How much is gained from the progressive work and strides he made compared to how much he reinforced and perpetuated stereotypes? To put this into perspective, I think the best way to explain this is with the concepts of punching up versus punching down in comedy. This refers to the idea that within comedy, usually your work will be better if you joke about groups that have a higher standing within society than your audience and yourself. For example, a comedian who doesn't make a lot of money might make jokes about rich people, because not only is he disconnected from that privilege, but his audience is also disconnected from that privilege. Rich people are not oppressed by society. Therefore, they make targets that have a lot of comedic value without being harmful to that group. The legendary George Carlin explains this concept very well.
There's a thing that I find unusual, and it's not a criticism so much, but his targets are underdogs. And comedy traditionally has picked on people in power, people who abuse their power. Women and gays and immigrants are kind of, to my way of thinking, underdogs. And, he ought to be careful because he's Jewish. And a lot of the people who want to pick on these kind of groups, the Jews are on that list a little further. You got women, gays, gypsies, blah, 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 and then suddenly you find Jews. And Andrew,
suddenly Andrew's arrested.
Yeah, so, obviously he should do what he wants. And
why does he get away with it, do you think, then?
Well,
we have never laughed at jokes about the poor.
He's appealing. I think he's appealing largely. I think his core audience are young white males who are threatened by these groups. I think a lot of these guys aren't sure of their manhood because that's a problem when you're going through adolescence. Am I really? Could I be? I hope I'm not one of them. And the women who assert themselves and are competent are a threat to these men, and so are immigrants in terms of jobs and the
so that's why we as an audience then will laugh.
You say we. I don't think you're. But I think you're
collective we.
I think that's what is at the core of that experience that takes place in these arenas. Is a certain, a sharing of anger and rage at these targets. And I'm sure Andrew isn't that angry at them. I'm sure he's playing it as a comic.
When it comes to John Callahan's work, he seemed to do best with work that was either far removed and esoteric, or work that criticized himself and groups similar to himself or higher. While he is a quadriplegic, he is still a straight, cis white man who has a lot of societal privilege. When he attacks feminists, POC, and other smaller groups, he's punching down. So for all of his work that was smart and well thought out, how does that compare to his more poorly executed gags? Does that mean we should throw him out as someone worth enjoying or analyzing? Personally, I believe that John Callahan's work should be critically respected. When we look at many great artists, there are countless examples of those who were some of the most atrocious people, even for their time. My favorite classical artist is Pablo Picasso. I love many of his Cubist pieces, and I personally think he's really talented. However, he was known for being extremely misogynistic and a womanizer, using many women as muses for his work. Does that mean his art shouldn't be discussed or respected? I wouldn't say so, but I think it's important to understand the context behind the artist. The idea of separating an artist from their work is a tricky subject, and not everyone can agree fully on one side. In my personal opinion, I think it depends on what work they produce in context to their actions. If someone was to make art that was created to empower or support POC in their fight against racism and discrimination, but then people found out that they were a white supremacist, of course it wouldn't be easy to separate the art from the artist. And even if they don't claim to be progressive, that doesn't excuse their regressive work either. But with someone like John Callahan, it seems that his work falls into either the offensive or well thought out. And in some ways, I think that makes it easier to enjoy the stuff he made that wasn't crass. Within my research, I found a key detail that, while not an excuse for anything he did, gives a bit of an insight into Callahan himself. Especially while looking at the documentary Touch Me Someplace I Can Feel, it seems that a lot of the offensive work John Callahan produced was more of a rebellion than anything. His actual views, at least from what he talked about, were fairly progressive, but I think he used offensive humor as almost a way to garner hate. He made it very clear that he did not want to be pitied or treated lesser because of who he was, and by creating work that shocked and angered people, he could have his audience yell at him rather than coddle him. The case of John Callahan as both an artist and a person is one that takes you through many twists and turns. His work was both some of the best and worst that dark humor has to offer, and gives a great case as to the ups and downs of its use. John Callahan was a man who lived by the philosophy of no target too big or small. He channeled his life into art that was both beautiful and horrible. While looking at him through a critical lens shows how truly horrible he could be, the work that seems to permeate his legacy was that brought smiles to people's faces. While he shouldn't be overtly revered, I think his voice was still one worth hearing from time to time. To end, I'd like to thank John the way he would have wanted. Thanks for the laughs, Callahan. And I hope hell's wheelchair accessible.